Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am, unfortunately, Adrian Fort, and we are here for part 8 of a 9-part series as we tackle What is Poetry by John Hall Wheelock. And this being part 8, which is titled Some Thoughts on Poetry. Surprise, this is not just some random chapter thrown into a book, which is lightly disguised as a definition of poetry. It is, in fact, some random chapter thrown into the end of some book which is vaguely described as a definition of poetry. But we will carry on anyhow. We begin with this, which is one hell of an opening paragraph. It is doubtful whether consciousness, a phenomenon originated and developed in the interests of survival, has sustained from moment to moment only by the most delicate balance, the most gigantic labor, the organs of the body functioning in perfect coordination, the heart hurling its oxygen-bearing bloodstream through the brain at a rate of 7.5 pounds per second. It is doubtful whether this inestimable pressure, purchased at so great a cost, is fully appreciated by any of us. The deeply rooted fear of death, the passion for continuance, a passion heightened perhaps by the suspicion that life is a gift vouchsafed but once, or, as Rilke has it, einmal, jedes nur einmal und nicht mehr. Once, to each, only once and no more. These bear witness on the instinctual level to the value we attach to consciousness. But we are speaking now of the rarer, the more articulate appreciation of this surprising thing, so often taken for granted, that affords us, as it were, a window on the huge spectacle of being, the antenna by which we receive vibrations from the outer world, the touch of a hand, the light of a star, that exquisite mirror where, as in still water, the trembling of the tiniest leaf and the slow drift of the clouds across heaven are reflected, the whole magical kaleidoscope panorama of things, out of whose forms and patterns we weave the individual fantasy that is our life, and whose pleasures, joys, yes, and ecstasies so greatly exceed. Though there are hours when we forget this, all the toils and pains and agonies we pay for the privilege of consciousness. Death itself, so inexorably and inevitably exacted in the end, will be, we are forced to admit, not too high a price to pay for that privilege, the privilege of having lived, of having experienced consciousness, even if once only. Wheelock really has a gift for slightly motivating and somehow less than informative whilst still intriguing paragraphs, doesn't he? That all sounds very nice. It's very intricate. It is vaguely inspiring, but I'm not sure exactly where we're going at this point. Speaking of the difficulty of the poem and the near impossibility of timelessness, Wheelock says on 103, as if it were not enough that language fluctuates with usage and is constantly changing, that words alter in value, shedding old denotations and connotations, and taking on new auras of tone and implication, there is the damage done to them by wear and tear. The bloom rubs off words that are wrongly employed or too often employed to trivial purposes. Words can go numb with the familiarity that comes from overuse, or indeed with the familiarity that comes from too long a contemplation of them. As every poet sooner or later discovers, he will have to put the difficult poem with its problems aside and return to it only when the feeling and tone of the words shall have been revived for him. I would remind you also that the precision of word choice is so precarious that all of these listed obstacles are enhanced by the order of a magnitude. But one example of what Wheelock is talking about here, the rose. If you submit a poem about a rose to a journal today, they're going to discontinue reading that poem as soon as they see the word. Whereas back in Shakespeare's day, this was cutting-edge technology for the art form. So it is the trick of timelessness is a hell of a task. But it is, some poets do succeed from time to time. I'm stumbling all over myself. Wheelock then talks about simultaneity and how in most other art forms it is simultaneity which helps create the individual piece, such as in painting, multiple figures on display at once create composition, create a movement. In music, 3 notes at the same time create a chord. You have a guitar playing at the same time you have a bass playing, at the same time you have the drums going, at the same time you have a singer. We have a movement going on orally. In writing, we don't have that joy. We must overcome the necessitated linear nature and delivery and still produce a sense of movement. And that is something which is quite difficult, but it is still, as Wheelock notes, achieved from time to time, and it's one of those things that is enviable when you see it done. Wheelock observes going forward, and this chapter is really sort of all over the place, observes that today's working poets seem to be almost exclusively academics. Then we get some real piss and vinegar on 110 and 111, and he goes to town here. Most of the poets who were professors, the academic poets of our day, have stood for the exact reverse of the narrow traditionalism and conservatism usually associated with that adjective. Our age has been enriched by the experimentation in which these poets, as well as their fellow painters and composers, have engaged. Indeed, singularity rather than perfection seems to have been, during the last 50 years, the aim of all the arts. Valery, you will remember, claims that this trend began with the advent of the Romantic movement that followed the disintegration of orthodoxy and of old standards of belief and taste towards the close of the 18th century. Novelty, quote, novelty, intensity, strangeness have for us in our, quote, insatiable thirst for originality, end quote, to use his words, supplanted the ideal of beauty. To be different at all costs has become almost the chief concern. To be called a, quote, rebel, unquote, to be characterized as intrepid, a dauntless innovator, a daring modernist, represents for an artist today the most signal accolade his peers can bestow upon him. Yet the very word modern, fetish of youth and of the advertising profession, is, after all, relative, has no absolute significance. You might think nothing had been modern until we came along. Why, bless us, everything has been modern for the past 5,000 years. Everything in its day is modern. The title, An Anthology of Modern Poetry, given to a collection issued in 1963, will read strangely to those who come across the book 100 or even 150 years from now. He's really going at it there. He doesn't like the tone behind the term modern. And he goes on to conclude that personality or individuality is clearly the source of originality. And I think it is definitely something to think about. The monumental movement of the modern in today's world and just what that has meant. And like he says, all of these art forms seem to be moving in congruence with one another. And you can sort of feel that a little bit. Even someone as distanced from most forms of mass media as myself, it seems that there are certain waves that come over art, and they seem to be driven today by music. I've got no real way of talking about those ideas other than the fact that in the late 80s, rap was coming onto the scene, and rap was melding with rock. And certainly the two are different art forms today, but they incorporate heavy elements of one another. And that's just in music. From this, poetry, there's been a schism in poetry too, like I said earlier in this series, seemingly from the fact that the poem is no longer relegated to simply rhyme and an image by something such as imagism, in which multiple images can be thrust forth in order to communicate one whole idea from those fractured parts. And it is those fractured parts that are seen so often in postmodern, I guess, paintings, where you don't have the reality, the verisimilitude necessitated on the painter by the fact that the photograph has come along and freed the painter to do and employ whatever he or she so sees fit. So I think that that is a stark divorce in today's art versus that of the past, if I'm making any sense at this point. Anyway, he concludes personality or individuality is clearly the source of originality, so that, on 113, what one looks for first then in a poet is personality, and after that, good workmanship. Neither, without the other, amounts to much. Their combination will be talent. Personality, as we have seen, implies originality. True originality is unconscious. You cannot be original by an act of will. In every period, there are always too many poets trying to be original in exactly the same way. Mere oddities of form or of manner, mere typographical innovations, though they may accompany, do not, of themselves, constitute originality. Originality may reveal itself in work that is traditional just as truly as in work that is experimental. Yeats has as much personality as Whitman, and his work is quite as original. Bach, who brought to its highest perfection the art of music as he found it in his own time, is as original as Beethoven, who gave the development of the symphony a new direction. Good workmanship implies a natural, inborn aptitude and a long, self-critical discipline in an art. For poetry, as Mr. Pound has been at pains to remind us, is an art. Good workmanship without personality, that is to say without originality, is merely virtuosity, empty technique. Personality without good workmanship, that is to say without art, becomes mere eccentricity. Good workmanship does not mean solely a disciplined, accomplished skill in the use of language, cadence, rhythm, rhyme, and formal structure. It means this, but it is also a practiced resourcefulness in the solving of aesthetic problems. The know-how to combine and organize often disparate materials into a unified work. And I think that is a pretty good summation, not of art, not of the artist, but of an artist. The reason you pick up Bukowski and read Bukowski is to see through Bukowski's eyes. The reason you seek out Caravaggio paintings and you adore Caravaggio paintings is because of the eye with which he saw the world and was able to then relay that vision. It is the same with novelists, it is the same with musicians, it is the same with singers, it is the same with poets, in all art forms. You certainly don't, and this is one of the problems with emerging into one's own artistic adulthood, if you will. Oftentimes, young writers, new writers, will emulate that artist or those artists which have inspired them the most to pick up the pen. And this is natural. Bukowski, to rely on subjects that I've already spoken about, Bukowski was inspired by Hemingway. No one picks up Bukowski to read Hemingway. No one picked up Hemingway to get Balzac. Balzac? However the hell you say that. But that was someone who inspired Hemingway. So as soon as the writer, the artist, the artiste, is able to formulate some voice of his or her own, the artist owes it to themselves to attack, to capitalize on that, to become the self, not in the shadow of the other, but alongside the other. And that is all that I have taken notes for in this chapter, Chapter 8, some thoughts on poetry. But I hope that you decide to join me next time for Chapter 9, titled Man's Struggle to Understand. And of course, women need not apply. So, that is this episode. Hit the like button if you would, please. It really helps us out here on the channel. Hit the subscribe button if you were not already subscribed and you enjoy this type of talk about literature. Hit the bell for notifications if you want to know when the next episode, episode 9, in this series drops. And if you were so inclined, there is a link to our Patreon to be found in the description below.